Very much welcome to the event. The title of the event this evening is Growth Stories and Economic Narratives for a Future Government. But we're here more than that to celebrate the publication of this book, Pursuing the Knowledge Economy, which is Nick's book. I say available in all good bookshops. Bookshops aren't very good at stocking public policy, economic policy books these days. But, in theory, it should be available at all good bookshops. But the purpose of tonight is to have a discussion about the arguments in the book, and then hopefully to ask some searching questions about the arguments that Nick is making. I'm sure a lot of you will know of Nick and his work, but Nick is Head of Policy at the Future Economic Research Centre at Manchester Metropolitan University, but his career has encompassed a number of roles, including working more on the interface of economic policy for the Labour Party, in government for the strategy unit, also for the European Commission. So I think the perspective we're going to get from Nick tonight will be a fascinating blend of insight from an understanding of where the academic debate is going, but also some of the more practical public policy implications. In addition to that, we're very privileged to be joined by Vicky Pryce, who I discovered today embarrassingly is actually a visiting professor at Queen Mary, having not realised that before, so welcome to your visiting position, Vicky. But Vicky is a long-standing government economic advisor, having worked as an economist and business consultant in a variety of roles. And she's going to discuss some of the implications of Nick's book, and also very privileged to be joined by my former colleague, Stuart Wood. Again, many of you will know of Stuart and his work, but Stuart is a former member of the Council of Economic Advisors in the Treasury, long-standing Labour economic advisor, now based, I think, in part at the University of Oxford, and again, will comment on the ideas that Nick is going to be developing this evening. So the format is very straightforward. Nick will start by making a presentation of around 30 minutes, I think, where he's going to set out the main arguments and theses in the book. We'll then turn for some responses from Stuart and Vicky, and then hopefully there'll be plenty of time at the end for discussion and questions. And it is worth staying to the end, not least because at 8 o'clock we have a wine reception outside, in which there'll be free drinks, so do please stay until the end. But without further ado, Nick, over to you.
Brilliant. Thanks very much for that introduction, Patrick, and thank you all for making your way here, finding your way here. I struggled and got locked in various engineering buildings on the way after tailgating the wrong people into the area. But today I want to talk to you about the economic narrative that I'm going to claim has dominated UK policy and political debate for the last 30 years. We're going to look at its increasingly obvious shortcomings, and then we're going to discuss what, if any, alternative growth stories might replace it. So, what do I mean by a growth story or an economic narrative? Well, broadly speaking, what I'm thinking about today are accounts of how economic prosperity can be achieved, but also about how economic prosperity is going to be distributed such that a wide cross-section of people get to participate in it and receive its benefits. What we might also call social inclusion or social justice. These accounts are sufficiently broad and deep to underwrite a government's policy agenda. They contain explanations of how the economy works that policymakers might use to justify their policy choices, and also an understanding that helps to inform those policy choices. So an understanding that directs them to one set of policies in preference to another. Now, obviously, there are a lot of such accounts of the economy out there, some of them coherent, some of them perhaps rather less so. The focus of today's talk is on politically compelling growth stories. Stories that are plausible and attractive enough that people are willing to vote for them, but that also survive contact with reality long enough for them to become embedded in the arguments and actions of politicians, civil servants, media commentators, businesses, and so on and so forth. So I'm going to start off today by introducing the growth story that I'm claiming has dominated UK politics and policy for the last 3 decades. The growth story that grew up around what used to be called the knowledge economy. Now that term isn't used that much anymore, at least not in UK politics, but as we will see, the policy agenda that was constructed around it is still very much with us today. Which is unfortunate because it doesn't work, or it doesn't work as well as we might have hoped, and I'll talk about some of those shortcomings in a little while. I'll then spend the second part of the talk exploring the implications of this analysis for politics today, looking at whether it's possible to salvage something from the knowledge economy agenda, maybe patch it up and repair it, or what alternative growth stories might replace it or perhaps supplement it in the run-up to the next general election. And as Patrick mentioned, this is all based on this book, reasonably priced, available in online bookstores. So, anyway, what was the knowledge economy narrative? Well, cast your mind back to the 1990s. I'm sure when you do so, you imagine an image somewhat like this. Back in the 1990s, the idea of a new knowledge-based economy seemed to capture the emergence of high-tech, high-growth industries in knowledge-intensive sectors such as pharmaceuticals, life sciences, particularly IT, information and communication technologies, advanced manufacturing, as well as the prominence of what we might call knowledge work in other sectors such as the creative arts or financial services. The emergence of all these industries was taken to indicate a shift away from physical, tangible work, physical, tangible production, making stuff with your hands or your physical machines, your typical industrial production line, a shift away from that economic model towards intangible knowledge work. Ever more value was being created by the production of ever more sophisticated ideas. So the script for a new movie, the code for a new piece of software, the layout of a new automated warehouse. Now, the rise of the knowledge economy was taken to imply that there were going to be loads of jobs in these new industries, if only countries could lure them to their shores and encourage them to grow. Oh, in case you're wondering, so this image from 1994, it's not something I dreamed up as teenage Nick on my Amiga 1200. Actually, this is a diagram, quote unquote, from a 1994 European Commission white paper on growth, competitiveness, and employment in the 21st century, which is a very, very professional effort, I'm sure we can all agree. So, what did the rise of the knowledge economy mean for public policy? Well, first and foremost, it meant that governments that wanted to capture a larger share of these valuable, rapidly expanding industries and the high-skill, high-wage jobs they brought with them needed to invest in the human capital of their citizens. Now, the knowledge economy narrative differed from more market-focused growth stories in that it did acknowledge an important role for government in inspiring innovation and achieving productivity growth. Because knowledge spills over, because education and research undertaken by individuals and firms creates knowledge and other benefits that other individuals and firms benefit from and build upon, it follows that free markets left to their own devices will undersupply investment in knowledge formation. At the same time, though, there was still an important role for the market in this narrative, an important role for dynamic, fast-acting, competitive markets. Higher levels of competition were deemed to encourage businesses to innovate, to stay ahead of their peers. Given the speed of technological change, it was deemed essential, that governments removed barriers to market forces. So deregulating markets, allowing labour and capital to flow to new emerging sectors just as quickly as they came up, just as quickly as they were invented. And also it meant keeping taxes relatively low. So there were larger incentives to individuals and businesses to invest and innovate. International openness was also a key part of this knowledge economy agenda. Importantly, for many politicians in advanced economies, knowledge-driven growth represented a solution to the problems arising from deindustrialization and economic decline associated with globalization and competition from lower wage economies overseas. Social investment would allow these advanced democracies to move up the global value chain and develop specialisms that other emerging economies would struggle to replicate because they lacked educational infrastructure to produce a large number of knowledge workers, because they lacked the rule of law and the security of particularly intellectual property rights necessary to reassure investors in innovation. And finally, that knowledge-driven growth agenda implied macroeconomic prudence, stable fiscal policy, stable monetary policy, low borrowing, low interest rates, low volatility, the kind of thing that's going to reassure investors that they're going to see stable returns if their investments in R&D do come to fruition, do result in useful innovations. But it's worth emphasising that this was not just about economic prosperity. It was also about how that prosperity would be distributed. It was also about social inclusion and social justice, that other key ingredient of a compelling growth story. In particular, it was meant to address regional and interpersonal forms of inequality. So let's take that regional inequality point first. I think too often political scientists and political commentators today, we talk about the left behind or left behind regions as if regional inequality didn't exist prior to 2016, prior to the Brexit vote or the Trump vote, this revolt in the old industrial heartlands of many developed democracies. Yet much of that discontent can be traced back to the 1980s and early 1990s, where there was already that growing sense that those former industrial heartlands have been shortchanged by market liberalisation and globalisation. The knowledge economy, knowledge-driven growth, was meant to remedy those problems. Many commentators, not all, but many, anticipated that the rise of the knowledge economy would mean that workers based anywhere in the country, potentially anywhere in the world, could work for any business they chose, or at least any high-tech business they chose, telecommuting into their virtual offices from their electronic cottages. All they needed was the skills necessary to compete, a computer, and access to relatively high-speed internet connections. And that was going to suffice to spread prosperity out from prosperous city regions, in the UK case from places like London and the southeast. And geography wasn't the only source of inequality that the rise of the knowledge economy was supposed to overcome. When technological change was coupled with public investment in education, skills, human capital, the idea was that wealth inequality, so interpersonal inequalities of wealth, those too would play a lesser role in determining people's life chances. Because in the knowledge economy, those kinds of non-human forms of capital, so access to finance, access to a factory to produce your stuff, all of that was meant to play a lesser role compared to human capital. The quintessential business of this era was a software company, and to have a software company, you can design, manufacture, distribute, market your product all from just a computer. That's all you needed. So the capital barrier to entry was deemed to be very low. So that meant that progressives could downplay traditional concerns about inequality and its impact on access to opportunities and social justice, which is why I decided to type into the DALL-E AI image generator Karl Marx working at a laptop at an internet startup. Which has produced this, which I think is quite nice, actually. Cool. So, as I mentioned before, the knowledge economy, knowledge-driven growth, these terms were used a lot back in the 1990s, but they have fallen out of fashion. But the ideas, the rhetoric, the policy agenda that accompanied them are still very much with us today. Now, I go into quite a lot of detail about continuity and change in those ideas in the aforementioned book. Today, I just want to make that case by plucking 3 quotations from prominent politicians in the UK from the last 10 years. Feel free to have a quick read of them, see if you can guess who I am quoting here. You can see from looking at them, they're talking about how education is going to address problems of regional inequality. They're talking about how education's going to address problems of interpersonal inequality. They're talking about how education's going to make the UK as a whole more competitive in the global economy. But they're also talking about market failures. They're talking about how businesses left to their own devices are going to undersupply education as well. So hopefully you've got your answers in mind. Did anyone get all three right? No. So the point I'm trying to make here is not that Osborne, Sunak, Miliband, they were arguing for the same thing, the same policies. That's not what I'm trying to say. And I think there's also an important debate to be had about whether they're all equally sincere, equally committed to matching this kind of rhetoric with resources, particularly if it means putting up taxes. But the point still stands that they're all operating on common rhetorical ground. They're all using the assumptions, the mechanisms of knowledge-driven growth, and to some degree championing policies that are compatible with that growth story. The problem is that that economic narrative is no longer as plausible, no longer as politically compelling as once it was. And perhaps the most obvious shortcoming of the knowledge-driven growth agenda is that it hasn't actually generated all that much growth, certainly when measured by productivity growth by historical standards. Yes, there was a productivity uptick in many advanced democracies in the 1990s, particularly acute in the UK and US, but that has flattened out in the post-financial crisis era. Now, obviously, there are lots of potential possible causes, many competing explanations for that productivity slowdown. Some of them are to do with innovation, so ideas that maybe we've plucked all the low-hanging fruit of innovation gain over the 20th century. Maybe our productivity figures underestimate the gains from certain types of innovation. Some explanations are more detached from innovation, so things like zombie firms kept alive on a drip feed of cheap money in the wake of the global financial crisis due to low interest rates, maybe lack of demand due to austerity. But even these explanations can be connected back to innovation and the knowledge economy. Certainly austerity, as we saw from that quote from Osborne a couple of slides ago, it's perfectly possible to maintain that you're doing knowledge-driven growth while pursuing austerity policies. It just implies a different trade-off between pillars like macroeconomic prudence, market dynamism and low taxes, and social investment. So it's still operating within the same landscape, it's just a different set of trade-offs. So what I want to do in this section of the talk is highlight some of the flaws in that knowledge-driven growth narrative that might explain why we haven't seen the growth that we were expecting back in the 1990s. Not just the growth, but also the improvements in social inclusion too. So there are important questions to be asked about the emphasis that narrative placed on skills. Are there really enough skilled knowledge jobs to go around? Are they all that well paid? Is public investment really sufficient to overcome social exclusion? And there are reasons to think that actually there may be many fewer knowledge jobs than we anticipated back in the 1990s. Although the UK labour market has seen, in common with many other advanced democracies, a shift towards higher skill, higher pay occupations over the last 3 decades, it's also seen growth in lower paid work as well. So we often hear that in the literature described as a hollowing out of the middle. There appears to be persistent demand for lower paid labour in sectors such as care, catering, maintenance, cleaning, and so on and so forth. Sectors where perhaps there isn't quite the same scope for productivity gains as there is in internationally tradable, intangible, knowledge-intensive goods and services. Added to that, knowledge work might be particularly susceptible to what we could call superstar effects, whereby demand is concentrated on the very highest performing individuals, teams and businesses, the superstars. So think about the first startup to build a particular network, a particular social network at scale, the first research lab to patent a particular genetic therapy. There's an emphasis on getting there first, a tendency towards winner-takes-all dynamics, which means that even high-tech sectors might not generate that many well-paid jobs. There might be a lot of jobs in those sectors, but actually the well-paid jobs will be limited to that small cluster of superstars. Another important factor to think about is the changing nature of technology. Increasingly, new technologies like AI are substituting for today's skilled workers, which could, under certain assumptions, result in lower wages, or at least a lower wage share of national income. Whereas back in the 1990s, the assumption was that demand for skilled workers would be pretty robust, that low-skilled people could pretty easily move into higher skilled work as and when they retrained. Finally, emerging economies such as India and China have also adopted knowledge-driven growth strategies, also attempted to upskill their own workforces. So increasingly, multinationals can find similar skill levels at lower wage levels overseas, further increasing the competition that UK workers face. Now, leaving aside those questions about knowledge work, let's look at the questionability of the claims about social inclusion. So it seems increasingly implausible to claim that high-tech industries have low capital requirements. They are low capital intensity. Even software startups tend to nowadays burn through quite a lot of capital in achieving the economies of scale and the network effects they need in order to compete successfully. So that capital requirement both limits the number of people who can be high-tech entrepreneurs. It also limits the kind of people who get the opportunity to be high-tech entrepreneurs, because access to wealth and access to those financial networks acts as a kind of filtering mechanism. And finally, the geographical clustering of high-tech industries has persisted, has in some ways increased over the last 30 years, which means they are, if anything, a poor solution to regional inequality too. Although you could argue that the pandemic has started to loosen some of those geographical ties to some degree. So, given all those disappointments, it's perhaps not surprising that a lot of people seem to be less convinced today by politicians who are promising them various flavours of knowledge-driven growth. And in the book, I look at how this discontent plays out in the voting habits of younger people, lower skilled or lower paid people, and residents of so-called left-behind regions. This discontent doesn't all tend in the same direction. Some people are attracted to the radical right, some to the radical left, some to apathy, disengagement, online conspiracy theories, and so on and so forth. But all of this discontent hollows out support for that erstwhile centre ground, that knowledge-driven growth centre ground, which makes it easier for outsiders to challenge that narrative. So what does all this mean for UK politics today? Well, the first thing to note is that there are still lots of people out there who want to salvage the knowledge-driven growth agenda. And you can see why it's so appealing. It does this wonderful fusion of growth, prosperity, and social justice. Rishi Sunak seems to be very taken with it, judging by several of his speeches. But to what extent is this feasible? What extent is this desirable? What would we have to do differently if salvaging knowledge-driven growth was our objective? Well, in the book I show that there are other countries that did knowledge-driven growth better. Higher levels of prosperity, higher levels of socio-economic equality. There are certainly lessons to be learned from the last 30 years about how to do knowledge-driven growth better. So in the UK, for instance, we tended to approach the problems of knowledge-driven growth with a work-fairist welfare system, so a minimal social security net, the understanding being we'd encourage people back to work, and that would encourage a dynamic labour market, also mean we didn't have to charge people much in tax, which would encourage a dynamic sort of business environment as well. Now, actually, it seems that countries that have pursued a more flexicurity approach, so Nordic countries, for example, where actually there were higher levels of out-of-work benefits, there was more security provided in employment law as well, there was more security for individuals to take risks, to move to a high-growth potential startup, to start up their own enterprise on their own. There was more of a security net to encourage those kind of productivity maximizing labour market decisions. So maybe we got that wrong. Maybe we didn't spend enough on education and research as well. Maybe, well, certainly compared to certain countries, we spent quite a bit less, even though we increased our spending on education under the new Labour years, quite substantially, but still not as much as some countries. So maybe we got the balance between tax, borrowing, and social investment wrong. And there's certainly an increasing body of evidence that suggests knowledge workers and knowledge-intensive businesses are less footloose, internationally mobile than we used to think they were. There's a growing body of evidence as well that suggests we probably could have borrowed quite a bit more, particularly over the last 10, 12 years at lower interest rates. Whether we could do so now without higher interest rates, higher inflation is another question. And finally, the UK, in common with the US, the EU, is now adopting a much more aggressive interventionist attitude towards market power in high-tech industries, particularly in the digital sector. So perhaps we needed a more interventionist, aggressive competition policy as well. But it seems doubtful to me, at least, whether these and similar interventions are going to fundamentally alter some of the dynamics we just talked about. So are they going to overcome the persistent importance of capital to high-tech industries? Are they going to avoid or somehow circumvent the job-destroying potential of AI? Are they going to unravel the tendency of high-tech industries to cluster geographically? Are they going to resolve the problem of superstar effects and so forth? So on that basis, I think it's time that we begin to look for alternative growth narratives, alternative growth stories. So what alternatives are out there? How much more time have we got? 5-10 minutes. Oh, great, excellent. So I'm going to talk briefly in this final section about 3 progressive alternatives to the knowledge-driven growth agenda. I'm going to talk about the everyday economy, I'm going to talk about mission-based growth, and I'm going to talk about what I term entrepreneurial egalitarianism, though actually having to say that out loud makes me think maybe I should term it something different. The list isn't conclusive. I'm really looking forward to hearing the suggestions of everyone in this room as to what alternative growth stories might be missing from this list. And I'd also say they're not the exclusive property of progressives either. There may well be versions of these growth stories that appeal to the more sensible strains within conservatism as well. Though, as you may gather from Patrick's introduction, I will tend to look at these through slightly Labour rose-tinted glasses. So let's take the everyday economy first, also hearing referred to as the foundational economy. So here I'm talking about the idea that policymakers need to focus less on those high-tech tradable industries and more on the everyday sectors that we interact with, such as care, childcare, basic utilities, maintenance for buildings, transport, waste management, food distribution, sectors that for a long time we've neglected. They haven't featured much in our growth story. And as a result, politicians haven't spent as much time, as much effort trying to push up wages in these sectors, trying to push up productivity in these sectors, trying to push up respect for these sectors as a matter of social recognition, or even trying to push up service quality in these sectors, which after all, given these are services we interact with pretty much on a daily basis, that would mean a material impact on our quality of everyday life. Now, the problem with this as a growth story is that it seems a little more like a distribution story than a growth story. It seems to be lacking that account of how prosperity is generated. Actually, it sounds like if you're talking about pushing up wages, this could be expensive, could require higher taxes, could prove inflationary, and that may be why Rachel Reeves, despite authoring this 2018 pamphlet on the everyday economy, hasn't talked as much about that idea since becoming Shadow Chancellor. Now, as it happens, I think there is a prosperity story to be told here. In fact, there are several prosperity stories to be told here. So we might focus on how we're stimulating demand, both at the aggregate level, but also at local levels, because these jobs in these everyday sectors are very widely distributed. So actually, this could be a way of injecting demand into down at heel communities that have not received as much growth in recent years. So it might be a way of stimulating activity at the local level. And also, these sectors are foundational to the rest of the economy. So where we're talking about nursery childcare for children, preschool children, where we're talking about healthcare, we're talking about various forms of human capital, essentially, and that is a vital input to every other industry. So actually, if we can improve the everyday economy, maybe there will be productivity benefits further down the line to other sectors and industries that draw on human capital as well. Perhaps more visible in the rhetoric of the current Labour Party is the language of missions. The implication of this mission language is that government can play a more active and more strategic role in promoting growth. We see that particularly as regards Labour's proposals around the green economy, and it's perhaps more obvious that there's a growth story there to tell. But clearly, for reasons of ecological limits, those are going to be growth industries for the foreseeable future, at least. But if you take this mission language seriously, then you begin to realise that it presumes a pretty comprehensive programme of public sector capacity building, of institution building, in order to make and execute effective industrial strategy. And we are really starting from zero on that. It's not clear that Labour is going down that route outside of the green economy. So green investment aside, a lot of the priorities that have been suggested include things like high-speed broadband rollout, university-centred innovation clusters, skills, all things that seem eerily reminiscent of that supply-side knowledge economy narrative. So the last possibility, which I rather grandiosely described as entrepreneurial egalitarianism, and regret it the more I try and pronounce it, essentially what I'm saying here, and it draws on the work of people like Heather Boushey, Wilkinson and Pickett, there is a growth story out there that suggests that actually we've simply become too unequal as a society. Actually, the level of inequality in the UK today is making people anxious, making people reluctant to take entrepreneurial decisions, making them reluctant to take risks. And actually, we might be able to unleash some growth potential, perhaps quite a lot of growth potential, by becoming a less unequal society. However, from a Labour Party perspective, sounds a bit like redistribution, sounds like it might be expensive, sounds like you might be putting up our taxes. Doesn't mean it couldn't work as a growth story, but you can see the objections there. So, just leave you finally with these thoughts we started with about what a growth story needs to do. We need something that speaks to both prosperity and social justice. We need something that's politically compelling, but also something that will survive contact with reality as well. So I will merely conclude by putting up a final plug for my book, and also my contact details in case you have any questions that follow from this. The publishers have given me a few books. If you want, you can have them for the knockdown price of, they told me I can sell them for £14, which is immensely inconvenient in terms of change. And I've just discovered that nowhere in London does cash anymore, so I haven't got any change. But maybe we can work out some kind of bank transfer thing. I mean, to be honest, having lugged them down from Manchester, I'm quite happy to exchange at least a couple for magic beans at this stage of the process. But thank you all for listening.
Thank you very much. Thanks a lot, Nick. That was a really good, I think, overview of the key themes of your book. So now we've got lots of opportunity for discussion and questions. I'm going to turn first of all to Stuart. I think he's going to respond and then come to Vicky.
Should I just stay here?
Yeah, go ahead.
Okay, well thank you very much for inviting me. It's a real pleasure to be here. So the first thing to say is this is, I read the book over the weekend and it is really excellent. It's entertaining, it's stimulating, it's coherent. That's not to say you'll agree with everything in it, but that's a property of a good book, right, rather than a bad book. It has theory and policy, it has economics and politics in a way that a lot of political economy books don't do both as well as each other. I think Nick does both really well. He's very careful about delineating between certain ideas and paradigms that often get thrown together. So he has a very good section on why neoliberalism is slightly different to what he's talking about. Honest about the limits of his explanation, has a really good few examples about big companies, which kind of are teachable moments, if you like, about the knowledge economy and where it goes wrong. And I was mentioning that neoliberalism, it's quite refreshing to read a book about this period, which isn't just, this lot were all just neoliberals, really. So it takes at face value what the politicians said they were about, and then disaggregates it. So all those reasons, it's really worth reading. Especially at the knockdown price of £14. I'm going to say three things, and these are sort of quibbles or sort of questions around the edges rather than trying to put a torpedo through the heart of the argument. One is about the coherence of the concept and of Nick's ideas about it. The second is about the politics behind it, which I think my view is I was involved with Patrick in the whole British example of this period, working for Gordon Brown for 10 years. I think the politics behind it are slightly different, or rather I see it to be done slightly different. And then thirdly, what went wrong, I'll talk about that. So the first thing about the coherence, and this is as critical as I'll get really, I really wonder whether talking about education in an economic way deserves the idea of there being a knowledge economy paradigm. Your quotes at the end about Osborne and Sunak and Ed Miliband. It's true that politicians talk about education with respect to the economic impact of it. I think that it flatters that to call it a knowledge economy paradigm. I'm not sure that really is. Politicians will always talk about education, partly to justify investing in it, with a view to the economic effects of it. That's just the sort of economic utilitarian way that the Treasury-dominated government instills in all governments. I think it's a leap to say that implies that everyone shares a basic knowledge economy paradigm. I think that's claiming a bit too much on behalf of the economic way of thinking about education. And by the way, if you look at education investment, there was an increase in Britain. I'm going to talk about Britain mostly. I'm happy to talk about the US if you like, but in Britain, in the new Labour years, as a percentage of GDP, education investment did go up back to where it was in the late 80s, I think. 80% of that was primary and secondary education spend. It wasn't on the glitzy, techie university end of it really at all. In fact, this was the period in which we introduced fees, right, for students to go to university. So the public investment story doesn't really reflect an absolute prioritization of the knowledge economy in that way. If anything, it was a restoration of public services agenda that was really at the heart of putting education, I think, first. So that's a different kind of thing. Second is an internal incoherence in the knowledge economy itself. And Nick's really good on this about how social investment in education was claimed to be bringing equality and higher wages for everyone, and clearly it couldn't do that. We know that the tech revolution is incredibly ambivalent, if not very bad for equality, and continues to be so. That it wasn't an engine of equality. He's very good on that, and he's completely right, it seems to me. And of course, this period coexists this idea of the knowledge economy liberating Charlie Ledbetter, who we know and love, talking about the idea of someone sitting in Sale or sitting in Cumbria, where my brother lives, and having a brilliant idea, and suddenly you'll be able to the returns to your ideas will suddenly flow in a way that wouldn't have been possible in a world dominated in the weighted economy by physical capital. We all know that that is an exaggeration, but we also know that this period of that fervour for those ideas coexisted at the bottom end of the labour market with incredibly liberal, deregulatory approach, where the state was topping up the private sector's inability to pay decent wages with a massive tax credit system, which the US, of course, innovated years before. The immigration was opened up, making the supply of labour much greater, putting pressure on wages. Full context of, remember the old days when we had access to the European Union market. Blair making it very clear, Gordon Brown making it very clear there'd be no return to the old industrial relations policies. So at the bottom end of the labour market, you had quite a deregulatory, economically liberal approach. There's a contradiction between that and expecting your knowledge economy stuff in the other end of the labour market to produce the equality and positive outcomes that you want. So there's an internal incoherence in the way that they thought of it. We thought of it, I guess. But thirdly, there's a coherence problem, I think, and I think this is probably slightly critical of the book. I think actually there's lots of different strands of what Nick calls the knowledge economy. You had a lot of people in government who were tech boosters, who thought that technology was going to transform everything from security to ID cards to personalised public services to growth. I think Tony Blair has a bit of that. Tony loves to this day when Tony Blair gives speeches. He's enamoured with the idea of what transformative potential technology has for absolutely everything. And you had that. Gordon Brown, who I worked with, wasn't like that in the same way. You had people who were serious about the theory of growth, the sort of Ed Ball's neoclassical, post-endogenous, classical, whatever it was. You had...
Not Brown, but Balls.
Not Brown, but Balls, exactly. But you also had, and this comes on to my points about political strategy, you had a political strategy where you have to remember what Labour and Clinton wanted to do. They wanted to prove to a sceptical country who thought that they were too lefty, that they weren't just economically liberal, neoliberal, they wouldn't use that terminology at the time, but they weren't just laissez-faire, let the market rip people. On the other hand, they weren't going to go back to corporatism and sort of beer and sandwiches and industrial cabals and union-dominated collective management of the economy. So how do you manage that? What is that? What's the space between the third way? How do you do it? If you're Gordon Brown, you still want to have huge amounts of public funding for business, but you can't do it in the same paradigm as before. And for what Nick calls the knowledge economy, from me sitting in the Treasury, was a political device to justify large levels of support through tax credits, R&D tax credits, and other sorts of public support for business. And it was a sort of picking winners approach, to be honest. So I think the politics behind this is more important. Let me just say a word about that. I think that what Nick calls the knowledge economy is born out of the political conundrum that the left had in the mid-90s, which is you're committed to trade openness, you're committed to globalization, you don't want to return to corporatism, you don't want to be laissez-faire, and you can't be seen to pick winners because that's electoral suicide. So what do? You don't pick winners, but you pick the factor of production, intellectual capital, or you invent the idea of intellectual capital as the most important factor of production. And you say that's what we're going to focus on because that's the key to the future. And that for me is the political package that made the knowledge economy convenient. But again, I don't think the policies of that period reflect the knowledge economy as the dominant thing in the way government went about its business. On the last point, by the way, one other thing. If you look at who voted for Trump and who didn't, and if you look at who voted for Brexit and who didn't, and who votes for Labour now and who doesn't, as many people know, class is far less of a predictive factor than it used to be. Education is a much bigger factor. So as a political strategy, it makes really big sense for the left to get more and more people into education, to stay in education, because it makes them much more loyal Labour voters. So if you were a cynic, and I don't think this was the reason at all, but as a political economic logic, focusing on education and keeping people in education and prioritising education is smart, self-reproducing political strategy for the left. What went wrong? Well, the 2008 crash went wrong, and this is just my worldview. It doesn't figure as much in your book, perhaps, but I think everything changes because the whole recipe for how Labour did its business in Britain and Clinton, the Clintonite Democrats in the US, even though Clinton had gone at this point. It is change when you can no longer combine globalization, liberal deregulation, liberal policy and immigration with having enough fat of the land from tax revenue from the businesses that are booming to do your redistribution and to do your public investment. That magic recipe lasts for a while, but the 2008 crash means it's not available anymore. And actually, for me, I think my other slight nuanced disagreement with Nick in this book, I don't see the knowledge economy surviving much beyond that. I see politicians talking about education as an important part of a good economy, but the idea of trying to at least pitch the sense of what Nick calls the knowledge economy, I think dies pretty much after that. And Nick's very good on what went wrong on the geography mattering more than people thought, the weightless economy. My old, sadly now no longer with us, collaborator Andrew Glynn, some of you may know of, read the works of. He used to, very early in the New Labour years, he used to say, oh, they keep banging on this bollocks about a weightless economy. It's complete nonsense. The economy is not weightless. And he kept a track of how weighty the economy continued to be. And he's right. And Nick's got good evidence and good discussion of that in his book about that not being right. And ultimately, I looked up in there's a survey recently that 36% of graduates in the UK are overqualified for the job they do. People are acquiring more skills and education than there is demand for in the economy. So ultimately, one of the big problems that Britain continues to have, is we haven't created, Britain's companies aren't demanding the kinds of skills that our politicians have called on the electorate to acquire. And that mismatch is still a huge problem. So I think I'll stop there. I was talking about the future, but I'll leave that for questions.
Brilliant. Okay, we can come back to some more comments. I'm sure, Nick, you're championing at the bit to respond to some of those points, but we'll try and fit some time in to do that after Vicky. So Vicky, over to you.
Yes, thank you very much. Well, I have to say that I have absolutely no problems with the book at all. I found it incredibly convincing that we were wrong in thinking that the knowledge economy was going to solve everything, and I've learned an awful lot. And the interesting thing is that it isn't just the UK. I mean, these issues are happening everywhere. And of course, you said you're not going to talk about the US, but there too we've actually seen, a hollowing out, if you like, of the middle classes, in the sense that real wages haven't increased over, decades. So on average, so that is an issue, and that some of the gains have gone to a few people right to the top. And it's not really hugely surprising, though. So the knowledge economy does still exist. That if you look at the list of the 10 top billionaires, they're all tech billionaires, with one exception, which is the Frenchman who owns Louis Vuitton. So the French know something about clothes that the rest of us don't. But the rest of them are all linked to tech. But of course, what has happened in those areas is huge amount of concentration that's taken place. So one of the things that has been happening is that the consolidation we've seen, particularly since the financial crisis, has resulted in this sort of inequality, if you like, becoming considerably bigger, which has left lots of people suffering down there. But also, I think what is quite interesting is that if you were listening to Andrew Bailey yesterday when he was talking at the LSE, and you've seen the Monetary Policy Committee's sort of monetary report that they put out just recently at the time of the interest rate increase, they look at productivity levels and what they've done and how they have been coming down for some time. The greatest fall has been in manufacturing productivity. And of course, one of the things that we've got a problem of here is that, unlike lots of other countries, we have a smaller manufacturing sector. Manufacturing is where productivity tends to be higher. Services, those intangibles, maybe we can't measure it, but overall, nevertheless, they're less productive than is the case for manufacturers. So we end up in this situation where you have, yes, lots of knowledge, a knowledge economy, but not enough productivity to justify the high wages that we would have had otherwise. So that is a fundamental problem that we're all facing, and it isn't just the UK, but it's others. But the fact that we have lost the manufacturing sector quite so significantly by comparison to some others has left us in a problem. I mentioned concentration, which is one of the issues. But even if you look at any type of company where you've seen this huge concentration take place, I mean, actually look at retail, look at everything else. What you find is that a study in the US showed that as concentration increased, if you look at different decades, the percentage of the excess profits that are made because of this concentration, particularly in the knowledge sector, that gets reinvested is considerably less than was the case 2 decades earlier. And apparently, an awful lot of the money that would have been spent in investing is spent lobbying so that they don't break us up, so that we can avoid some of the fines that the EU Commission perhaps might impose on us, or that we can remain united rather than suffer, or big rather than suffer the split that, say, the oil companies had suffered all those years ago, where the Seven Sisters were created. Now, of course, what we've seen is the opposite there as well. All those companies, I used to work for Exxon, it's now become bigger because it's basically merged with 1 or 2 other oil companies. So that is the trend, and it's interesting how it has happened, and that the regulators have not been able to stop it. So I think that if we're looking at growth in the future and how maybe to get that knowledge economy impact to be spread more widely, that would be quite nice to see some more sort of competition rules being imposed so that doesn't happen. And it is interesting also about people and how they get their remuneration, because what has been happening with all these big tech firms is that they have been hoovering up every available resource of that knowledge, if you like, of those knowledge workers, which meant that for a large number of the smaller firms, these people were not available. They were just being taken away. So you couldn't get the profits, if you like, of using those people because they were simply not available. Now, of course, because of the downturn that has taken place, which of course, we've seen what's happened with the banking sector as well, that had lent a lot to tech companies, not very many of them making money. I'm not talking about the big ones. Quite a lot of firms are getting rid of people, even the big ones, which makes it slightly easier. So we might see a bit of a change taking place. But I think if we are to just think about history a little bit, although I did want to focus on what happens on the future, which I think is what you want to talk about later. You both remember that I used to be, under Labour, there were these PSA targets with public service agreements, and there were 30 at the second half of the 2000s. And number 1 was the productivity one, which I was responsible for. And then it was sort of reasonably easy. We weren't necessarily thinking about the knowledge economy, even though we did produce the first innovation strategy under Patricia Hewitt. But skills were very much part of the productivity picture, and they still are, whoever you may be talking to. But of course, when you look at, yes, innovation, really important, investment, really important, competition, really important, entrepreneurship, really important, all those things that we think are part of the productivity thing. You can't do any of those things without the skills. So it isn't just educating people so that they can vote properly, which I think is actually a pretty good thing if they're more knowledgeable, but it is that all these things that help productivity just won't happen. So there is a knowledge economy up to a point, but if we were to just say, oh, there isn't a knowledge economy, because what we had predicted was that Labour was going to have a bigger share of GDP in the future, if all the slides that we used to produce suggested that actually this hasn't happened, capital remains big. But that is because we have allowed it to happen. We have allowed competition to evaporate, basically, in many areas, and we've allowed those rents to be accumulated by a few people. So it's a failure of government policy to get to grip with that, in my view. But let's look at what there may be ahead for us. I looked at the OECD just before the pandemic. Remember we had shocks, of course, which really affect things very significantly. We had, of course, Brexit, which has affected things significantly. And it's quite interesting remembering what happened with the Brexit debate. It was all about how can we be part of this group which has the huge welfare spending that takes place and drains away resources from other things that could lead to higher growth, and we should be looking at other countries which don't have any welfare support and deal with them in the East somewhere. Anyway, so the interesting thing about the book is that it says very clearly, and one of the ways in which you get wages to improve and increase the share in GDP is by people moving, people really getting trained, moving, jobs frequently. And what the book shows very clearly is that, by comparison, say, to the naughty countries, partly because of course, what's happened recently with COVID and everything else, but even before, the churn rate, people were not moving jobs as frequently, and now, of course, become even less the case that people would move jobs. The welfare, the support system is hugely important in allowing that movement to take place more frequently, because we have an appalling both unemployment and sickness and disability and everything else support system, and that allows people to take risks, to move more frequently, and know there is a support mechanism there for them. They acquire the knowledge, they become more productive as a result. So I don't think we can dismiss this whole thing as yes, okay, we had anticipated all sorts of things, but it didn't happen. But in reality, it isn't just the fact that we're not acquiring the knowledge, it is the fact that it isn't deployed in the right way, and we've allowed all the structures to change. Okay, so what does the ECD say? It says how to get growth. So I'm almost quoting. The first thing they suggest is that we should have light product regulation and allow as much flexibility as possible. We do actually in the UK have relatively light product regulation, or at least we did until recently. And we should have low debt levels, well, to ensure that there's room to deal with crisis. Well, we've had a crisis, so perhaps that's forgotten now. I mean, we can't have low debt levels, they're high. So that is another element that's gone away, if you like. Yes, some things about bankruptcy provisions. I think even under Labour, this would change to allow for people to start again, to be a bit more in the US, so that you can facilitate restructuring, so economies can move again if there is a crisis. And then very significantly, labour market policies that promote employment and growth, and ensure really that labour remains, there's good labour participation at the right levels, to avoid, of course, hysteresis, which is one of the things that we've been suffering from. You get people unemployed. So if your policies change so much, like they did, for example, with the financial crisis and beyond, austerity kills it. I mean, I come from Greece, the entire middle class, as you've been talking about in the book, has been basically eliminated. And people with education work as barmen, if they're lucky, or they come here and work as barmen, if they're lucky. So that can happen, but you also need a financial sector which plays a really important role in money transmission and so on. But you need to have robust and both micro and macro prudential regulation. Well, here we are in the middle of another sort of banking crisis. So what does this mean, really? The idea that we're going to just to get growth, we're going to deregulate in the financial sector in particular. Well, thrown out, I mean, there's no way that can happen now. So you're not going to get that type of growth. The idea that we can remain open and start trading with all these other countries I mentioned, we know full well they will add very little. The idea that we can become, even under Labour policies, a green superpower is for the birds, given that what is happening with geopolitics is that we now have big regions, and they are the ones that determine what's going to happen. We have China, the US, and Europe, frankly. And we are a small country, can do very little unless it is really properly integrated into the rest. So Brexit is a disaster, and that is, whatever we do with all these little changes that we may want to make to skills or anything else, this interconnectivity is going to be the thing that's missing. And therefore growth will not really happen. And look at any forecast right now in terms of how we lag behind all the others in terms of getting back to pre-pandemic levels. And green jobs, of course, Labour is making a big thing about this, but everyone is making a big thing about this. But I do remember, I have to say, sitting at my desk when Gordon Brown, I think, was number 10, and getting a call from number 10 saying that a speech was due to be made, and they wanted confirmation, or they were going to say that there would be, maybe you wrote the speech, 400,000 green jobs would be created as a result of whatever it is that we're going to climate change, green. And I said, 400,000, where do you get this from? Well, 400,000, how can we get that figure? I said, well, then we may, but they will be replacing other jobs. It's not going to be new jobs. So I sort of refused to say anything, to confirm that. At all, I remember the pressure being put on it. Anyway, the speech was made, 400,000 new jobs in the green economy, and that was going to be our solution to all our problems. So in a way, sort of, I rest my case. We just don't know how we're going to move in the future. But I think, I have to say, knowledge is key, and it's how we use it and how the economy adapts to this, and how that knowledge can be the knowledge that is acquired from across borders and not one country on its own trying to do it, which is going to get us back to normal growth levels that we used to see before the financial crisis.
Okay, that's great. Thank you so much. I think 2 really good sets of provocations and comments there. Just leaves me to say thanks so much to everyone for making it along this evening and joining the discussion. We do have some drinks outside if you want to join us for a quick drink before you go. But I should also obviously say big thanks to the panel, to Vicky, to Stuart, and also in particular to Nick for sharing some really interesting, I think, ideas which have triggered a lot of discussion and debate, which I'm sure will go on over the next year or so as Labour and other progressive parties try to fashion the narrative ahead of the next election. So please, on behalf of the Marlin Institute, join me in thanking the panel.